Have you ever noticed how much of our lives is spent searching for healing? We move through this world collecting wounds, some visible, some hidden deep within the chambers of our hearts. We seek remedies in countless forms, in the embrace of loved ones, in the wisdom of therapists, in the quietude of meditation, in the pages of books promising transformation. We chase cures through medicine, through spirituality, through relationships, through achievement. Yet for many of us, something remains unresolved, a persistent ache that no earthly remedy seems to fully address. What if I told you that the ultimate healing, the resolution we so desperately seek, might come not from life, but from its ending? This is perhaps the most profound paradox revealed through decades of research into near-death experiences, that death itself, the very thing we fear most, may be the greatest healer of all. I've spent my life documenting the accounts of those who have briefly crossed the threshold between worlds. Time and again, they return with a striking similarity in their testimonies, a sense of profound resolution, of burdens lifted, of wounds that have carried for decades suddenly dissolved. They describe a sensation that defies our limited vocabulary, something beyond mere relief or understanding. It is as if they have been immersed in the ultimate healing balm, one that reaches places within us that no earthly medicine could ever touch. Consider the case of Elizabeth, a woman who carried the weight of childhood trauma for 63 years. After a cardiac arrest during routine surgery, she found herself suspended in a realm of inexplicable love and acceptance. It wasn't that she forgot what happened to her, but rather that she could finally see it from a perspective that removed its power over her. It was like a knot that had been tangled within her for her entire life suddenly unraveled without effort. When Elizabeth returned to consciousness, the psychological wounds that had defined her existence had not disappeared from memory, but they had been fundamentally transformed. Or Michael, who had spent decades in a cycle of addiction and self-destruction, fueled by a deep sense of unworthiness. During his near-death experience following a car accident, he encountered what he could only describe as a washing away of everything that wasn't truly him. Upon his return, the compulsions that had controlled his life for so long were simply gone. Not through struggle or willpower, but through a fundamental shift in perception that no amount of therapy had previously achieved. These accounts suggest something remarkable, that perhaps death, rather than being the ultimate loss, might instead be the ultimate healer. This isn't to romanticize the end of life or to diminish the very real grief of separation. Rather, it's to consider that perhaps what we call death is actually a process of profound restoration. The first glimpse of this healing often comes through what many near-death experiencers describe as the life review. Unlike our living recollections, fragmented and filtered through our limited perspectives, this review unfolds with remarkable clarity and compassion. People report witnessing not just their actions, but the ripple effects of those actions, experiencing their impact on others from both perspectives simultaneously. Yet, and this is crucial, they describe experiencing this panoramic view of their lives without judgment, instead enveloped in a profound understanding and acceptance. Sarah, who nearly died from an allergic reaction, described it this way. She saw moments she had been ashamed of for decades, choices she had punished herself for repeatedly. But as she watched these scenes unfold, she felt only a deep understanding of why she had acted as she did, what she had been seeking, what she had feared. The shame simply dissolved in the presence of this complete understanding. This phenomenon suggests something profound about the nature of the wounds we carry. Perhaps many of our deepest hurts persist, not because they are too severe to heal, but because we cannot access the perspective necessary for their resolution while embedded in the limitations of physical existence. Perhaps the ultimate medicine for these wounds is not found in more time, more work, more processing, but in a fundamental shift in consciousness that death itself facilitates. The patterns that emerge from thousands of these accounts suggest that death may function as a kind of spiritual solvent, dissolving the accumulated layers of fear, shame, regret, and misunderstanding that we gather throughout our lives. It appears to strip away not our essence, but rather the accretions that have obscured it, revealing a core self that many describe as more real than real. What's particularly striking is how consistent this pattern of healing appears across different backgrounds, beliefs, and circumstances. Whether the individual was religious or atheist, young or old, prepared for death or caught by surprise, this sensation of profound resolution emerges with remarkable consistency. It suggests that this healing capacity may be intrinsic to the death process itself, not merely a psychological comfort constructed by a dying brain. As we contemplate this possibility, we might begin to see death not as the failure of healing, but as its fulfillment. Not as the enemy of life, but as its completion. Not as a punishment, but as a resolution that life itself, with all its treatments and therapies and growth, has been gradually preparing us for all along. Consider for a moment the invisible scars we all carry. Some are formed in childhood, the whispered criticisms that became our inner voices. Others are born from betrayals, from losses, from moments when life's fragility was suddenly, painfully apparent. We carry these wounds with us, often unaware of how they shape our every choice, our every relationship, our every reaction. They become so deeply woven into the fabric of our identity that we struggle to distinguish where the wound ends and where we begin. In life, healing these wounds is arduous work. We revisit painful memories in therapy. We practice forgiveness. We engage in shadow work. We learn new patterns of thought and behavior. Yet so often, something remains unresolved. The child who felt unworthy becomes an adult who achieves remarkable success, yet still feels fundamentally inadequate. The person betrayed becomes guarded in all relationships, unable to fully surrender to trust. The survivor of trauma remains hypervigilant, body and mind always prepared for danger, even decades after the threat has passed. What the phenomenon of near-death experiences suggests is revolutionary. That these persistent wounds, these seemingly indelible marks on our souls, can be healed completely, but perhaps only through a shift in consciousness so profound that it typically occurs only in death. This is not a failure of psychological approaches or spiritual practices. Rather, it suggests that full healing requires a perspective impossible to achieve while embedded in the very identity shaped by these wounds. James, a veteran who struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder for nearly 40 years after his service, described his near-death experience following a heart attack. For the first time since the war, he felt whole. Not because he forgot what he had seen or done, but because he understood it within a vastness that transcended his individual experience. The weight he had carried for decades, the guilt, the horror, the sense of brokenness, dissolved not through forgetting, but through a profound expansion of understanding. When he returned to his body, the nightmares that had plagued him for decades simply stopped. The hypervigilance that had kept him isolated from loved ones gave way to a deep capacity for presence and connection. What makes these cases so remarkable is not just the relief from symptoms, but the apparent permanence of the transformation. Unlike temporary states of transcendence that might be achieved through meditation or psychedelic experiences, the healing that occurs during near-death experiences often appears to fundamentally rewire the individual's relationship to their past. The change persists even after they return to ordinary consciousness, suggesting that something profound has occurred at the deepest levels of their being. This pattern has been documented across thousands of cases, spanning different cultures, belief systems, and circumstances. People who have never heard of near-death experiences report strikingly similar patterns of healing. They describe a dissolution of the boundaries of the self, the very boundaries within which our wounds have been contained and defined. Without those boundaries, the wounds themselves cannot persist in the same form. Consider the nature of what we call trauma. At its core, it's a fragmentation, a breach in our sense of coherence, safety, and meaning. In life, healing trauma involves gradually rebuilding these shattered elements, a process that can take decades and may never feel complete. Yet in near-death experiences, people consistently report an immediate reintegration, a restoration of wholeness that doesn't negate what happened, but somehow incorporates it into a larger tapestry of meaning. Rachel, who survived a brutal assault in her 20s, carried the psychological effects for over 30 years. After a near-fatal illness at 63, she described her near-death experience. She found herself in the presence of overwhelming compassion, where she could see not only her own suffering, but its place within a vast pattern of interconnection. Her assault wasn't erased or diminished, but somehow the meaning of it transformed completely. When she returned, the hyper-arousal, the intrusive memories, the deep sense of violation that had colored her existence for decades, they were simply gone, replaced by a profound sense of compassion for herself and, remarkably, for her attacker as well. This isn't to suggest that such healing is only possible through death or near death. Rather, these experiences may reveal a potential for healing that exists within all of us, a capacity for complete resolution that perhaps our physical existence, with its necessary boundaries and limitations, typically prevents us from fully accessing. The question then becomes not whether such healing is possible, but whether glimpses of it might be available to us in life as well. What near-death experiences suggest is that perhaps the most persistent wounds we carry remain unhealed, not because they are too severe, but because the perspective required for their healing lies beyond the boundaries of our ordinary consciousness. What if the medicine we need isn't more processing, more years of therapy, more spiritual practice, but a fundamental shift in how we perceive ourselves in relation to existence itself? Those who have returned from the threshold describe this shift as one from identification with the separate self to a recognition of themselves as expressions of a larger consciousness. From this expanded perspective, the wounds that seem defining suddenly appear temporary, contextual, painful passages in a much larger story. The healing occurs not through erasure but through expansion, through a radical recontextualization. That life, bound as it is by the constraints of individuality, rarely permits us to fully experience. Perhaps this is what makes death the supreme healer, its ability to dissolve the very boundaries within which our wounds have been contained and defined. Perhaps what life spends decades attempting to heal through gradual processes of growth and integration, death accomplishes in an instant through the complete dissolution of the separate self. The scars that seemed indelible suddenly become transparent in the light of a greater understanding. What happens in that sacred moment of transition? Those who have ventured to the edge and returned speak of an experience beyond our limited vocabulary, yet their accounts reveal remarkable patterns. Time, that constant companion and constraint of earthly life, suddenly operates by different rules, or perhaps ceases to operate at all. Many describe a sensation of all moments existing simultaneously, the linear progression of past, present, and future, dissolving into a single, expansive now. In this timeless state, the hurried urgency that characterizes so much of our healing work, the sense that we must resolve our wounds before it's too late, simply evaporates. There is suddenly all the time in the world, or perhaps more accurately, there is no time at all. The language of those who have glimpsed this realm often turns paradoxical. They speak of a silence filled with communication, of darkness illuminated from within, of being everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. These are not poetic flourishes, but desperate attempts to convey experiences that transcend the categories of thought shaped by physical existence. What they describe is a consciousness liberated from the constraints that have defined its entire existence, a consciousness suddenly free to perceive without the filters and limitations that physical embodiment necessitates. In this expanded state, the mental and emotional patterns that have maintained our wounds, the repetitive thoughts, the protective barriers, the limiting beliefs, suddenly appear as exactly what they are, temporary constructs rather than fundamental truths. The woman who has spent decades believing I am broken suddenly recognizes this as merely a thought pattern, not an ontological reality. The man who has organized his entire existence around avoiding vulnerability witnesses this as simply one possible orientation among many, not an essential aspect of his being. The healing that occurs in this state is not merely psychological, but seems to operate at a level we might call spiritual, a restructuring of the very foundation of identity and perception. Jonathan, a physician who experienced clinical death during a surgical complication, described it as a complete reorganization of how I understood myself in relation to existence. It wasn't that my problems were solved, it was that the very framework within which I had understood them as problems dissolved completely. Upon his return, the chronic anxiety that had plagued him since childhood was simply absent, replaced by a deep, abiding sense of trust in the fundamental nature of reality. What makes these accounts so compelling is the consistency with which people describe encountering a presence or light characterized by unconditional love and complete acceptance. Unlike the conditional acceptance we might experience in even our most supportive human relationships, this acceptance appears to be absolute, embracing every aspect of the person's being without reservation or judgment. Mistakes, regrets, flaws, wounds, all are held in this vast compassion that demands no change, no improvement, no atonement. It is perhaps this unconditional acceptance that constitutes the ultimate medicine, the healing balm for which our souls have longed throughout the struggles and striving of earthly existence. Maria, who nearly died during childbirth, described encountering what she could only call love in its purest form, completely unbounded by conditions or expectations. In the presence of this love, the deep sense of unworthiness that had shaped her entire life simply dissolved. It wasn't that I suddenly became worthy, she explained. It was that I recognized the entire framework of worthiness and unworthiness as a profound misunderstanding of reality. In that space, such concepts had no meaning at all. When she returned to her body and her newborn child, the depression and anxiety she had feared would accompany motherhood never materialized. Instead, she found herself capable of a presence and openness that transformed not only her relationship with her child, but with everyone in her life. These accounts suggest that perhaps what we perceive as death is actually a dismantling of the very structures of consciousness that maintain our suffering, a liberation from the limited perspective that has prevented complete healing during life. If this is true, then death may indeed be the ultimate healer, not because it ends existence, but because it expands it beyond the boundaries within which our wounds have been contained and defined. This perspective offers a profound reframing of what we call death. Rather than seeing it as a failure of medicine, a defeat in the battle against decline, we might recognize it as the fulfillment of the healing process that life itself initiates. Perhaps all our earthly healing work, the therapy, the spiritual practices, the self-improvement, the relationships, are not meant to achieve complete resolution, but rather to prepare us for the ultimate healing that death itself will provide. What's particularly striking is how consistent this pattern appears across different belief systems and cultural backgrounds. Whether the individual was religious or secular, whether they anticipated an afterlife or expected complete cessation, the healing they describe follows remarkably similar patterns. This suggests that this healing capacity may be intrinsic to consciousness itself rather than dependent on particular beliefs or preparations. David, an atheist who nearly died in a climbing accident, found himself in what he could only describe as a state of consciousness beyond anything I had imagined possible. Despite his lifelong conviction that death would be the end of experience, he encountered what he later described as not a deity, but a quality of consciousness characterized by boundless compassion and understanding. In this state, the deep sense of isolation and disconnection that had fueled his depression since adolescence simply dissolved. Upon his return, he remained an atheist in terms of not believing in a personal God, yet the healing he experienced translated into a profound shift in his relationship with himself and others. The depression never returned, he explained, not because I now believed in an afterlife, but because I had experienced directly that consciousness is vaster and more interconnected than I had ever imagined. This suggests that the healing death provides may not depend on particular beliefs or preparations, but may instead be an inherent aspect of the consciousness transition we call death itself. It may be available to all of us, regardless of our spiritual orientation or the specific nature of our wounds. Perhaps this is what makes death the great equalizer, not that it comes to all of us eventually, but that it offers to each of us, without discrimination, the healing for which we have secretly longed. This is not to suggest that we should romanticize death or seek it prematurely. Rather, it invites us to recognize that perhaps the healing process continues beyond what we perceive as the end, that what appears to be an interruption of healing may actually be its fulfillment. For those grieving loved ones, this perspective offers a profound comfort. The possibility that what we perceive as the ultimate loss may actually be the ultimate resolution, the final healing of wounds that life itself, with all its beauty and opportunity, could never quite fully resolve. Perhaps one of the most remarkable aspects of near-death experiences is what happens after people return. Those who have briefly touched that realm of complete healing and then find themselves back in the constraints of physical existence bring something extraordinary with them. A transformed relationship with both life and death. They return with what we might call death eyes, a perspective fundamentally altered by having glimpsed beyond the veil. This perspective doesn't diminish their engagement with life, but rather transforms it entirely. Research has documented consistent patterns of change among those who have experienced NDEs. Many report a dramatic reduction in the fear of death, not just intellectually, but at the deepest emotional levels. This isn't wishful thinking or denial, but rather a profound shift in perception. Having experienced what they describe as a more real reality beyond physical existence, death loses its sting. As one experiencer put it, "I no longer fear death, because I no longer believe in it, at least not in the way I once did." What I experienced wasn't an ending, but an expansion beyond anything I could have imagined. This diminished fear doesn't lead to recklessness or a devaluing of physical existence. Quite the opposite. Those who return often describe a heightened appreciation for the preciousness of embodied life. They tend to live more fully present, more deeply engaged with each moment, liberated from the background anxiety about mortality that subtly constrains so many of us. Having experienced the ultimate healing that awaits, they're free to embrace life with a wholeness and authenticity that was previously unattainable. Thomas, who experienced an NDE after a severe car accident, described this paradoxical relationship. "Before my experience, I was so afraid of death that I wasn't really living. I was always holding back, always trying to stay safe, always worried about what others thought of me. Now that I've seen what awaits, I'm free to fully engage with life in a way I never could before. I've been cured of my fear, and that cure has transformed every aspect of my existence." This transformation often extends to profound changes in values and priorities. Many who return from NDEs report a significant shift away from materialistic concerns toward greater emphasis on love, compassion, and spiritual growth. Career paths are altered, relationships transformed, as the clarity gained through their experience illuminates what truly matters. The perspective gained through briefly touching that realm of complete healing often reveals the relative insignificance of many of the concerns that previously dominated their lives. Rebecca, an ambitious corporate lawyer who experienced an NDE during surgery, returned to completely restructure her life. "I saw with perfect clarity how I had been pursuing success at the expense of connection, accumulating achievements but missing the very purpose of existence. When I returned, it wasn't that I suddenly disliked my work, it was that I could see it in proper proportion to everything else. The ambitious drive that had controlled my decisions simply dissolved, replaced by a deep knowing of what actually mattered." She continued practicing law, but shifted to environmental protection, working fewer hours and prioritizing her relationships in a way that would have seemed inconceivable before her experience. Another consistent pattern is the development of heightened empathy and compassion. Having experienced the interconnected nature of consciousness beyond physical boundaries, many return with a dramatically expanded capacity to understand and share the feelings of others. The boundaries between self and other become more permeable, more fluid. Grudges that had persisted for decades suddenly dissolve in the light of this expanded perspective. Old wounds in relationships heal not through effort or processing, but through a fundamental shift in how the person perceives both themselves and others. James, who had been estranged from his brother for nearly 20 years over a business dispute, found that after his NDE, the anger and resentment that had seemed so justified and intractable simply vanished. "I could suddenly see the whole situation from a perspective beyond my own hurt and pride. I could feel his pain as clearly as my own. The dispute that had seemed so important, worth sacrificing our relationship over, suddenly appeared as what it truly was. A tragic misunderstanding between two people who loved each other, but were caught in their own limited perspectives." Within weeks of his recovery, he reached out to his brother, initiating a healing that transformed both their lives. This expansion of empathy extends beyond personal relationships to a deeper connection with humanity as a whole. Many report a dissolution of prejudices and judgments, a recognition of the fundamental equality and value of all people regardless of differences. Having glimpsed a realm where the superficial distinctions that divide us dissolve, they return with an inability to maintain the same barriers and hierarchies that previously shaped their perception of others. Perhaps most significantly, those who return often develop what we might call integrated spirituality, a direct experiential understanding of spiritual realities that transcends religious dogma or intellectual frameworks. This isn't about adopting specific beliefs, but rather about direct knowing that informs every aspect of their lives. Whether they were previously religious, atheist, or somewhere in between, they typically return with a certainty about the spiritual nature of existence that no amount of theological argument could either instill or shake. Lisa, who identified as a committed materialist before her NDE during childbirth, described this transformation. "I didn't come back a religious person. I came back someone who had directly experienced the limitless nature of consciousness. I didn't adopt beliefs. I simply couldn't deny what I had experienced firsthand." The philosophical materialism that had previously defined my worldview was revealed not as wrong, exactly, but as dramatically incomplete, a partial perspective, mistaken for the whole. Her professional work as a scientist continued, but informed by a deeper understanding of the limits of the materialist paradigm and a profound respect for the mystery underlying physical reality. What makes these transformations so remarkable is their apparent permanence. Unlike temporary spiritual experiences or insights gained through psychedelics or deep meditation, the changes that follow NDEs typically persist for decades. This suggests that something fundamental has been altered in the person's consciousness, not a momentary glimpse quickly forgotten upon return to ordinary reality, but a permanent expansion of perspective that continues to inform every aspect of their lives. This durability of transformation suggests that what occurs during an NDE isn't merely a psychological or perceptual anomaly, but a genuine encounter with a more fundamental reality, one that, once experienced, cannot be forgotten or dismissed. The healing that begins in that realm continues to unfold long after the person has returned to physical existence, as if the medicine administered there continues working within them, gradually transforming every aspect of their being. For those of us who haven't had such experiences, these accounts offer a profound invitation to consider that perhaps the ultimate healing we seek isn't found in more therapy, more medication, more spiritual practice, but awaits us all in that final transition we call death. And perhaps more importantly, they suggest that glimpses of this healing perspective might be available to us even now, without requiring a close brush with death, if we can momentarily step beyond the limited identity that maintains our wounds. So, how might we integrate this profound understanding into our daily lives? How can we access something of this ultimate medicine while still in the midst of our journey? While the complete healing that death appears to offer may not be fully available to us in life, there are practices that can give us glimpses of that expanded perspective, practices that might be understood as rehearsals for the great transition. Ancient traditions across cultures have recognized this possibility. The Tibetan Book of the Dead isn't just a guide for the dying, but a manual for the living, teaching practitioners to recognize in life the same states of consciousness they will encounter in death. Socrates described philosophy itself as the practice of death, not in a morbid sense, but as a gradual loosening of identification with the limited self that prevents us from seeing the larger truth of our existence. Christian mysticism speaks of dying before you die, experiencing a dissolution of the egoic self that allows for a more direct connection with divine reality. These traditions recognize what modern near-death research confirms, that while embodied we can touch, if only briefly and partially, the same expanded consciousness that death ultimately brings in its fullness through meditation, contemplative prayer, certain forms of breathwork, and other spiritual technologies. We can temporarily transcend the boundaries of our ordinary identity and glimpse the healing perspective that awaits us all. These practices might be understood as small deaths, temporary surrenders of the limited identity that maintains our wounds. In deep meditation, for instance, practitioners often report experiences strikingly similar to aspects of NDEs, a dissolution of boundaries between self and other, a transcendence of time, a deep sense of interconnection with all of existence. While typically less complete than the expansion that occurs in death, these experiences can nonetheless offer profound healing insights that gradually transform our relationship with ourselves and our wounds. Thomas, a meditation teacher who regularly guides retreats focused on this approach, describes it this way: "We're not trying to escape life, but rather to momentarily step outside the narrow perspective that maintains our suffering. In deep meditation, we can briefly experience the dissolution of the very structures of consciousness that keep our wounds in place. When we return to ordinary awareness, something has shifted, not dramatically, as in an NDE, but incrementally. With consistent practice, these small shifts accumulate into profound transformation. This approach differs fundamentally from many therapeutic modalities that seek to heal wounds while maintaining the same basic structure of identity. Rather than trying to make the wound itself whole, these practices temporarily transcend the self altogether, allowing us to recognize that our deepest nature was never wounded in the first place. Upon return to ordinary consciousness, the wounds haven't disappeared, but our relationship to them has been fundamentally altered." Rachel, who developed a meditation practice after her NDE, described this distinction. "Before my experience, therapy helped me develop a healthier relationship with my trauma, to see myself as a survivor rather than a victim, to recognize my resilience, to create new patterns of response. These were valuable shifts, but they still maintained the fundamental framework where the trauma was central to my identity. After my NDE and now through my spiritual practice, I can access a perspective where I recognize that while the trauma happened to my body and mind, it never touched my deepest nature. From that perspective, healing isn't about improving the wounded self, but about recognizing a dimension of being that was never wounded at all. This approach doesn't negate the value of conventional healing modalities. Rather, it suggests that our therapeutic work might be understood as preparing the ground for deeper healing, creating the conditions where glimpses of expanded consciousness become possible. The psychological integration that therapy facilitates may be a necessary precursor to the spiritual transcendence that offers more complete healing. Another practice that can help us access something of death's healing power is the contemplation of our own mortality. Not in a fearful or morbid way, but as a means of clarifying what truly matters. When we sincerely confront the reality that our time is limited, many of the concerns that dominate our daily consciousness are revealed as trivial. Grudges we've held for years suddenly seem pointless in the face of our finite existence. Anxieties about status or appearance lose their grip when we recognize they will soon be utterly irrelevant. This practice, what philosophers call memento mori, the remembrance of death, doesn't diminish life but rather enhances its vividness and meaning. By keeping death close in our awareness, we paradoxically become more fully alive, more present to the miracle of each moment. The healing that death eventually brings in its fullness begins to work within us even now, as our awareness of mortality gradually dissolves the barriers to love and presence that we've constructed throughout our lives. Perhaps the most direct way to access death's healing wisdom is through deep engagement with those who are dying. Hospice workers often report that accompanying others through the dying process transforms their own relationship with life and death. Witnessing the profound shifts in consciousness that often occur as people approach death can give us glimpses of the healing that awaits us all. Elizabeth, a hospice nurse for over 30 years, described this phenomenon. "I've had the privilege of being present with hundreds of people as they've made the transition. What I've witnessed has completely transformed my understanding of both life and death. So often, people who have struggled their entire lives with depression, anxiety, or unresolved trauma experience a profound healing in their final days or hours. Something shifts in their consciousness. You can see it in their eyes, in the sudden peace that comes over them. After decades of bearing witness to this process, I no longer fear death. Instead, I've come to see it as the fulfillment of the healing journey that life itself represents. This isn't to diminish the very real grief of separation that death brings. The loss of loved ones remains one of life's most painful experiences. Yet perhaps even grief might be transformed if we could truly understand that what appears as an ending may actually be a completion. the final resolution of wounds that life itself, with all its beauty and opportunity, could never quite fully heal. What if we could live with the wisdom of death while still fully engaged in the journey of life? What if we could recognize that the ultimate healing awaits us all, not as some distant heavenly reward, but as the natural completion of the consciousness journey we call human existence? Perhaps then we could live with less fear, less grasping, less resistance to the inevitable transitions that life brings. Perhaps we could embrace each moment with the knowledge that nothing essential is ever truly lost, that the wounds we carry will ultimately find their resolution, that the love we cultivate continues beyond the boundaries of physical existence. This understanding doesn't lead to passivity or resignation, quite the opposite. It frees us to engage more fully with life, knowing that our journey continues beyond what appears to be the end. It invites us to recognize death not as the enemy of healing, but as its fulfillment, not as the opponent of medicine, but as the ultimate physician, not as the failure of life, but as its completion. In this recognition lies a profound peace, not the peace of denial or escapism, but the deep serenity that comes from aligning ourselves with the true nature of existence. The ultimate medicine awaits us all. Until then, we can live in its light, allowing the certainty of our eventual healing to illuminate and transform every aspect of our journey. Death, it turns out, may be not the failure of healing, but its final, magnificent fulfillment.